up, everybody? This is Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations, number 21. So it's Black Music Month, and, we already have been all Outkast everything, but I'm excited about this one today because we're taking Outkast international, diasporic, if you will. And we're joined today by the dope Dr. Shana Redmond. What's going on, Dr. Redmond? How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. So I know you out there on the West Coast and everything and at USC, but you have to get into the club. How did you become Outkasted?
Outkasted. Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about that question, and I grew up in Racine, Wisconsin. And yes, there are Black people in Wisconsin. And right? It was a real moment for me thinking back on this because I remember when Southern Playalistic came out, and I remember hearing it on the radio. It was my freshman year of high school, and I remember thinking to myself that this is something I have never heard before, right? What we're used to hearing on the radio is, at best what was happening on the East Coast and on the most kind of commercial scale of it. So when I heard that, it was just a mind-blowing experience. I had to listen to it again and again and again and kind of settle into it and try to figure out where I was, because it sounded like nothing else I had ever heard before. But it was interesting because now thinking about that moment, I recognized that it actually helped me to understand more about me. My people are from Mississippi, and so that song actually helped me to better understand my dad's brothers and sisters, right? To think about why they were driving, in the 1990s, 1970s Buick Regals and Eldorados, and why that was the business for them. Like that song actually helped me to think more about where they were from, why they cared about the things that they cared about, and why it was relevant today. So I definitely took Southern Playalistic as this moment of entrance to thinking about what the South had to offer, and Outkast was the perfect kind of conduit for me to think about that. So it was that moment, but then I knew that I was a stan when everybody was waiting on Speaker Box Love Below. Like I knew when I had the drop date for the album on my calendar and was ready to go to the store and purchase it, that's when I knew for sure that Outkast was going to be a part of my forever.
That's dope. I really feel bad for these kids these days who don't know the joy of going to the record store or looking on the wall and you see the release dates. I didn't have the phone, so I had a little piece of paper and some pen. I'm like, okay, these are coming out on this date. I have to make sure that I'm in the building. But you do work in sound studies, which is, we're kind of after my own heart here a little bit. But you recently had a book drop, Anthem, which is amazing, by the way. Could you give a little bit of a description of your book and what it contributes to what you were talking about previously in terms of, race and identity and mobility, if you will?
Yeah, so the book is called Anthem, Social Movements and the Sound of Solidarity in the African Diaspora. And the book is really interested in trying to track the developing Black political cultures in the 20th century, so how Black people after World War I began to define who they were, in particular through thinking through their citizenship practices. So I look at 6 different Black movement organizations over the span of the 20th century and think about them and their efforts at mobilization through performance, specifically through their anthems. These songs that were adopted by organizations like the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's organization, or like the NAACP, and look at them on a transnational scale, how different types of diasporas were being developed amongst and between Black people throughout the 20th century, and how music became a strategy for people in thinking about how to adjust their political circumstances and to enact different types of futures. So the work of the book is something that's very close to everything that's been important to me since I entered college, which was thinking about racial formation, but also thinking how music fits very centrally into that formation and how Black people communicate with one another. It's through music, and sound being that element that is more mobile than other types of art texts, allows for different types of literacies, right? Black music is not necessarily a literate formation. You don't have to read music in order to participate, in order to understand, in order to take away certain types of evidences from Black music. So that's why it was really important in part for me to think about it through music, because it is this communication between Black people and helps us to move and exchange ideas and performance practices in a way that other types of arts or other types of writing don't do. So this question of mobility then is really important for thinking both about music, just writ large, but then also thinking about how Blackness develops. It's always through constant exchange, movement, negotiation of different spaces and communities. It's not a static thing, it's dynamic always. So I think the music is really the evidence of that dynamism.
I think that the idea of Black music kind of is a form of mobile community, meaning that you don't necessarily have to be from the same geographic spaces in order to appreciate what music can do in terms of relaying, you know, as you pointed out, these negotiations of race and performance and all that good stuff. But to use your framework from Anthem to think about Outkast is really dope, because it actually opens up what their music means, not necessarily for people in the South, but also, you know, how they reach out to other forms of community. When you're talking about, you know, the anthem aspect of it, for example, you know, what are some of the ways that we can think about Outkast, you know, as anthem makers, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of ways that we can think about it. I mean, they don't necessarily fit into more of the kind of rigid paradigm that I was using for the book, right? Just for the sake of making it containable, which is songs that were adopted by movement organizations. But they do a lot of work for helping us to think about racial formation, to think about culture in the development of political identity. Absolutely. I mean, one of the most interesting things for me in having conversations about the book is about people tossing out their own anthems, right? Saying to me, well, what about this song? What about this song? And I think that absolutely would apply with Outkast across the board, right? Not just for folks in the South, but for people across the U.S., but also globally. Because I think that Outkast does a lot of work actually for thinking about how the local becomes the national, becomes the transnational, right? Becomes all of these negotiating methods by which we speak to one another. They're so incredibly fluent in their own experiences and the cultures that surrounds them that they can make it accessible to anybody who listens, right? Anyone who listens intently. So I think that they have become one of these, you know, relatively recent. 20 years is a long time in hip hop, most definitely, but they're still somehow incredibly fresh, right? Like they're always in front of, you know, slightly ahead of whatever we think is the illness right now. They're always ahead of that. And I think that, you know, the Afrofuturism that has always been present in their work actually lends itself to thinking about how their music extends beyond their particular location and well out into the world. So even thinking about something like B.O.B., right? You know, something that is in the context, being dropped in the context of war, right? Even getting someone who is 14, 15 years old to ask the question, where the hell is Baghdad? Right? Like that is something in and of itself that only, you know, certain types of public thinkers can do. And I think musicians are especially adept at begging the question, right? Getting people to really investigate what's being put in front of them. And Outkast does that in all of these fantastic ways. So they absolutely have anthemic qualities to so many of their songs. And I think you know, a lot of times we think about the kind of transition to Anthem as as at first being popular, right? If it reaches a certain amount of popularity, then it becomes an anthem. But I think for Outkast, quite often it's the inverse, that it's already an anthem, and that's why it becomes popular, right? That the anthem is something that's connecting to people on a deeper level, is resonating beyond just the charts. People have an attachment to it, and Outkast is exceptional in developing these songs that out the gate are just anthems for people, that people identify with, listen to regularly, constant loops, right, are making reference to in their writing, in their clothing, in their conversations with people.
I know that you wrote a piece on Janelle Monáe that I actually was kind of perusing because I'm trying to finish up my own Outkast article. And you were talking about Afro materialism, and I thought that was brilliant because, you know, it actually extends what you're saying, that they don't exist in this one particular moment. They pull from multiple entry points of time to create, you know, thinking about the future and also while, you know, being in the present. But it makes me, you know, it makes me think about Outkast in terms of the trajectory of civil rights in the South, right? This idea that music annotates the freedom struggle in the South. So when you think about, you know, the Freedom Singers and Sweet Honey in the Rock, you know, these folks, what do you think Outkast's contribution is in terms of continuing this conversation about freedom struggle in the South?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do a lot for it, actually. I mean, one of the most important things about thinking through these anthems in my previous work was to think about this element of pride, and that Black people are actually taking a stake in their representation in the world, right? It's not just something that's happening behind closed doors, but these are anthems. These are songs that people are announcing as their representation. And I think this element of pride that comes out of Black music making is absolutely representative of not only, you know, thinking across a long genealogy of Black music, but then it's something that Outkast picks up very strongly on. And again, thinking about these local cultures, right? It was really interesting for me to listen again to a lot of their work and the ways in which they develop conversations around food cultures in their songs, right? That is quite often very regionally situated, right? Like sweeter than yams with extra syrup, right? Like all of these ways in which they're bringing out the particularities of their experience as representative of something larger. But that's them taking pride and ownership over their cultures, right? And so I think that in that way, it very much maps on to a civil rights kind of sonic history in which people were articulating the things that were important to them, things that were going to be contrary to what people were witnessing or experiencing in the mainstream. I mean, you think about somebody like Nina Simone, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, right? That this pride element, that they're really owning who they are, even in the face of all of these false demonizations and characterizations, stereotypes. But of course, the other thing is just the ways in which that they're able to link up to these iconic histories through mentioning folks like Rosa Parks, right? So for even all of the ways in which Rosa Parks becomes indicative or iconic of a particular type of civil rights history that boils it down and doesn't examine particularity, raising her name, right, elicits some engagement with the civil rights movement. And even with all of the hoopla and backlash that came from that song, right, the lawsuits, et cetera, what's interesting to me is thinking through that song, particularly in relation to the video. Because in the video, right, they have the dancers out in the streets and they're taking up public space. And that's the whole scenario from which we understand Rosa Parks' intervention, was that she was taking up public space, right, refusing to sit in the back of the bus. So in the video, you have them out in the streets, being Black, doing Black things, right? The different types of step dances, all of the rhythms that are coming from that break in the latter part of the song, right? And so I can see this longer history being kind of pulled out three-dimensionally in the work that they're producing, because they are such a visual group. right? That you have to consider some of those elements as well. And so I think that that song, actually, if you think about it in relationship to the video, in relationship to the types of communities that they're bringing to the fore, then they're actually continuing in some significant respect with some of the elements that brought the civil rights movement to everyone's screens.
Wow. Never thought about Rosa Parks like that in terms of the multi-dimensional aspects that you're talking about. That's dope. Well, what about this idea of diaspora, right? The African diaspora in terms of dispersal of folks of African descent. Oftentimes, when we think about diaspora, we automatically go to the transatlantic slave trade as part of the foundation for how we understand what diaspora means. But Anthem brings up a really interesting point in terms of a sonic diaspora, meaning like the sounds that are associated with these diasporic narratives is equally, if not more so, important than kind of like the other tangible representations of the diaspora. What are some of the ways that, not necessarily just Outkast, but just, maybe even hip-hop in general could be used to contribute to this idea of diaspora now as compared to previous decades?
I mean, hip hop we already understand is a global form, right? I mean, I think in the post-civil rights movement, thinking about how hip hop has become kind of the sonic manifesto of urban streets, right? Even rural streets. I don't want to be particular because now we have all of these opportunities to hear differently from people who may not have the types of access to media markets and things that people in New York, LA, Atlanta have, right? But that hip-hop has now become this manifesto globally. And I think it's interesting to think about how it's dispersed, but then also how it's received. So part of this question of diaspora is not just dispersal, but settlement. How do all of these populations and bodies and cultures settle in these different locations? And I think more work needs to be done, honestly, about thinking about the reception of these musics abroad. But the work that has been done has been really interesting and, a lot of it anthropological and thinking about how it becomes adopted in these cultures, not just aesthetically with some of the streetwear, urban streetwear that's been witnessed in other parts of the world, but how these musics then facilitate other types of native responses, how people like Tupac and Biggie and Outkast and all types of other folks get picked up as kind of models for local MCs in these other sites around the world. So I'm thinking, a good friend of mine, Edwin Hill, works on hip hop in Paris, right? So the ways in which they begin to model themselves after some of the artists that are coming out in the United States, using hip hop as this method of response in a similar way as it's been used in the United States. And certainly my experiences of traveling in different countries in Africa definitely are representative of how hip hop has become a certain type of access point to the U.S., but also, interestingly, a rebuttal to the types of kind of local pressures and violences that people are facing, right? Recognizing hip-hop as a method of dissent, even if in the United States we don't recognize it as such anymore, right? We have all types of debates in hip-hop about, well, they're conscious, they're not, or you're not following the history of hip-hop, you're not true to the history of hip-hop. But there are ways in which its global circuit have made it or continued its history of rebellion in these local sites elsewhere. And I think that, the innovation that's been coming out of groups like Outkast, again, are really pushing the form, encouraging people to think about their relationship to not only their communities, which is still very central, their local communities, but also to these global communities and markets that people now have to respond to their fans in South Africa, their fans in Ghana, their fans in London, right, in all of these complicated ways.
Awesome. Dr. Redmond, how can folks get in contact with you and what are you working on and all that other good stuff?
I'm currently working on a few things, just some smaller pieces on like Marvin Gaye and Flying Lotus. My next book project is looking at aid music, songs like We Are the World, and thinking about how diaspora actually begins to break down through a construction of a Black first world in these songs. So really thinking about music and disaster in this moment. But you can catch me on Twitter at Shana Redmond. You can catch me on email. Check out my faculty site at USC and reach me that way. I'm happy to communicate with folks and keep the conversation going.
Awesome. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all next week. Y'all be easy.